with you. And I'm pleased now to introduce Dr. Ingrid Parker with the University of California, Santa Cruz. And Dr. Parker will be providing the first segment of a State of the Broom talk.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Can you see myself and my slides okay, Justin?
Looking good, looking good.
Okay, great. So I get to be the first part of this three-part talk. And my part of it is talking about what everyone should know about Scotch Broom but was afraid to ask. But I want to start by giving a huge shout out to organizations like the Washington Invasive Species Council, because I've been working on Scotch Broom my entire career, and I just feel that I have gained so enormously from all of my conversations with practitioners and stakeholders in the invasive species realm. And it's organizations like the Washington Invasive Species Council and CALIPSI down in California and all across the country that bring together researchers and practitioners to have these conversations like we're having today and this week. And it's just transformative. And I just want to say thank you for everything that you do. I also want to thank all the practitioners and managers that have worked with me over the years from a number of different organizations, and especially most recently, Jill Silver and the 10,000 Years Institute that I'm very excited to be collaborating with. And so thank you, Jill, for bringing me and Sarah and Karen back into the broom fold. And before I get started on broom biology, I want to do a little preamble, which is that over the last few years, I've been working on a manuscript that just came out in Biological Invasions. And if you're interested in having a copy of this or any of the other work that I'm going to be talking about today, please feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to share it. But this paper is about bridging the knowing-doing gap. And the knowing-doing gap is this term that academic scientists use to talk about how they feel that they're doing this research and somehow it's not translating into meaningful management, and that somehow if we magically could just bridge this communication gap, then our research that is behind a paywall could be used more effectively in making change on the ground. And in this paper, we explore how this is sort of an old way of thinking, and I really want to just promote the newer way of thinking, which is that what we really need to be doing is working together to define the research questions, working together to define the studies and do the studies so that what we end up with is information that we all want. So that's just kind of something to put in the back of your mind. Okay, so State of the Broom, what everyone should know about Scotch Broom but is afraid to ask. And I want to start by saying I realize that there are many people in the audience today who have spent as much time with Scotch Broom as I have, so a lot of deep knowledge about this plant in the audience. But then there are also many people who are newcomers to Scotch Broom and Scotch Broom biology, and you are so welcome here. We're so happy to have you. And I want to get my job is to get everybody on the same page and just kind of talk about some of the basics that everyone should know. And I want to say thanks to my co-authors too. Okay, so Scotch Broom. It's a horrible, gnarly shrub. It gets that big. That's kind of all I have to say. And oh my gosh, it can be so incredibly dominant in the landscape. And I have showed this photo to my colleagues in Spain where it's native. And it just blows their mind to see the plant behaving in this kind of a way, taking over everything. So the plant is native to South and Central Europe, but it's been introduced all over the world. So it's invading in many different places. In terms of Western North America, we know that it was in California sometime around the mid 1800s and was introduced into Washington sometime probably after that. The first specimen that we have of Scotch Broom collected in Washington was taken from a garden in Seattle in 1888. So by then we know it was being used as a horticultural plant, and we know that by the 1930s it was already considered a weedy problem. There are other stories that you might hear about how Scotch Broom was used as a packing material, and it might have been spread around by railroads. And we were just talking earlier about how we would love to have a genetic study that kind of tracks the history of where broom has was originated in the West Coast and how it spread. But data are coming on that eventually, hopefully. Okay, in terms of what other species you might mistake for Scotch broom, there's a couple you should know about. One is gorse. So gorse looks a lot like Scotch broom up close until you notice that it's got horrible, nasty spines. So that's one. And the other one is Spanish broom, Spartium gentium, which has, whoops, sorry, there we go, which has stems that are a little brighter green and a little smoother. And also, if you look at the flowers of Spanish broom, they're pokey. So that's really different from a Scotch broom flower. Okay, why is Scotch broom so hard to control? Well, for one thing, it makes a ton of seeds. So how many seeds does a Scotch broom plant make? You're going to see numbers all over the board about this. Sometimes people will say, oh, it makes 27,000 seeds. Well, human beings can live to be 120 years old, but what does that really tell you? That's one piece of information, right? What we'd like to know is kind of on average, how many seeds does a Scotch broom plant make? So I have counted seeds on Scotch broom for probably thousands of plants. And what I can tell you is a plant my size in Seattle will make around 8,000 seeds on average. What's really interesting is that same size plant in the South Puget Sound prairies will make only about 1,000 seeds. And that's because they're pollen limited. And that's a really cool story, but it's for another day. It could be changing from climate change or evolution. Maybe Robert Bodie will tell us more about that later. Okay, in addition to making tons of seeds, Scotch broom seeds live a really long time. So I have a bunch of seeds in my laboratory that I collected in the mid-90s that we are still using for experiments. But the fact that they live forever in a lab doesn't really tell us much about the dynamics of the seed bank in the field. And people like Tim Harrington have worked some on this, but this is another area where we'd really like to have more information. Scotch broom seeds are explosively dispersed. We call it ballistic dispersal. And then a cool thing about their natural history is that ants also disperse Scotch broom seeds. So our native harvester ant up there in Washington, sometimes you'll see them carrying Scotch broom seeds around. One piece of good news that everyone should know is that Scotch broom does not spread by rhizomes. It germinates from seeds. So all of the new plants produced are coming from seed germination. Okay, why is it so hard to control? This is one thing that I want to mention because I think it's the source of a lot of misunderstandings about Scotch broom and how fast it can grow and how fast it can make seeds and things. I think a lot of times people think it's growing faster than it is, and that's because they don't notice it when it's small. So here's an example. A number of years ago, in a collaboration with Joint Base, Lewis McCord, we did a huge experiment where they removed the broom from 5 very large sites. And this is what the sites look like after the initial control was done. And if you went out there a year later, it was looking really good. Like there was no broom there. And that continued, continued to look pretty good. A full year later, there's just a few little plants here and there. But mostly that site's looking great. Okay, one more growing season, you go back, and this is what it looks like. Okay, broom over my head, like literally everywhere. Well, that broom didn't show up out of nothing. It was growing there. It's just, the broom goes through this incredibly rapid growth phase between years 3 and 4, and suddenly it's everywhere. So in this picture, that same stump is there, and that pink sign, and the broom is over my head. So what that means is that if you're trying to assess the success of a control effort or removal effort, you need to be thinking ahead. You can't just go out there and say, oh, it looks good. You have to actually be going out and counting how many seedlings are germinating and how many stumps are resprouting in order to make a plan for how you're going to continue control at your site. Okay, why does broom have a big impact? I think we're going to hear more about that this morning, but one of the main factors is just it's incredibly dense. So tons of seedlings germinating, and those seedlings grow up into big plants. And if you crawl around in these broom thickets, this is what you see. Tons of broom stems, tons of dead broom stems as self-thinning is occurring in there, but almost nothing else. So just really, really thick broom. In addition to its high density, broom has allelopathy, this sort of plant chemical warfare idea. So Scotch broom tissues have a high degree of alkaloids, in particular spartine. And if you take the stems and leaves of Scotch broom and you chop them up and you mix them up into soil, or you take soil from around Scotch broom plants and you try growing other plants in it, they don't like it. So, so that's a problem. In addition, Scotch broom is a nitrogen fixer. So it's a legume. It makes, it has symbiotic bacteria that it has a mutualistic interaction with, and those bacteria actually take atmospheric nitrogen and usually, not always, but usually will increase the levels of nitrogen in the soil around the plant. Now that could sound good if what you want to do is add nitrogen to your soil, but it can also be a bad thing if, because adding nitrogen to your system can increase the growth of aggressive exotic plants, particularly grasses, that then will compete with your natives.
Dr. Parker,
Okay.
This is your 1 minute warning.
Thank you, that's perfect. I was just going to say, I'm going to go through this very quickly, this last point, because we're out of time. But basically, I want to encourage everyone to think of yourself as an experimentalist practitioner. You can do this in your backyard. One of the things we've discovered from doing the same experiment in multiple places is that you can get really different outcomes. And it's pretty simple to collect the kind of data that you need in order to understand what your site is like. So just knowing a little bit about how many seeds are germinating in your site and whether your stumps are resprouting can make a big difference. So for example, in the question of whether triclopyr or just cutting your plants is an effective way to kill plants. In one site, we found they were equally effective. In other sites, the herbicide did much better. And so you have to do that on a site-by-site basis sometimes. But that gives you power to think about how to manage your site. Okay, I'm going to finish with my motto, which is there's always more to learn. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Justin. Thanks.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I am pulling my slides up. Can you see it, Ingrid?
Yeah, looks great.
Looking good.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I just wanted to start out by thanking everyone for helping me create this presentation. Like to thank all the different county noxious weed control boards, the state noxious weed control board, all the conservation districts in the state that have been collaborating with us throughout this entire month of the Scotch Broom census. And you'll see how everyone contributed shortly in this talk. And it's really my pleasure and kind of my honor that I get to speak about this from a statewide perspective, because over the past month we've seen just an astronomical amount of interest and people contributing to this effort. So to start out, wanted to cover the regulatory status of Scotch Broom. Thanks to the State Noxious Weed Control Board for providing this information. So in Washington State, there's 3 tiers of noxious weeds legally, and Scotch Broom is the mid-range level, so Class B. And really the goal for Class Bs is to prioritize them for management in certain areas, but not all areas. And eradication would be a great goal, but is not required. Really the goal is containment and stopping the spread. And it's worth noting that counties have the ability to prioritize this for required management, but that's a local decision. And I think that one thing that's really great about the state noxious weed laws is that there is guidance from the state, but ultimately the county also has the decision to make the best decision about requiring control for their landowners and their constituents. So looking at the regulatory status from a state perspective, the State Noxious Weed Control Board has selected the species for required control in certain areas of the state. And as you look at this map, you'll see that it's required in Region 4, Region 5, excluding Klickitat County, and then also in Region 6. So mostly in Eastern Washington and counties east of the Cascades. And that's because there really is not that much there, and there's a lot of agricultural use, and really the goal is to stop it when it does show up in that area. But from a required control perspective, there is a significant burden to landowners in enforcing control, where control might cost you thousands of dollars per year. And so something that's nice is that the state has the ability to have a definition to the law, and then ultimately the local state county weed control board could require control if they felt like it was appropriate for their specific setting. Something else to note is that it is illegal to transport, buy, or sell Scotch Broom, and it's not often that it shows up in nurseries or being sold, but really wanted to highlight this. And if you see Scotch Broom being sold by any group that's selling plants, we would recommend that you contact the Plant Services Division at the State Department of Agriculture, or you could notify me at the Invasive Species Council, and would certainly respond quickly to put an end to that. So what is the known distribution? This map here is a little bit updated from the one that we used for the economic study that Jill Silver referenced. And you can see that really from a state perspective, we have categorized the amount of Scotch Broom at the county level. And you can see that some counties have greater than 1,000 acres. Well, that is difficult to assign a value for potential control or to take any action, because there's really no upper limit to this. And so if you can take the most conservative estimate per county, we have, let's just call it 16,000 acres in Washington of Scotch Broom. And that sounds like a lot, but something that I'll point out a little later on is how many millions of acres are in the entire state. And so while there is a lot of Scotch Broom in certain areas, there's a lot more of the state that does not have Scotch Broom, which is, I think, worth pointing out. So Jill Silver referenced this, and I won't spend a ton of time on it, but in 2017, state agencies put together an economic study looking at what the impact of Scotch Broom would be directly and indirectly to our economy if Scotch Broom were allowed to spread 12% from its current footprint at that time. So where Scotch Broom was located, there was no management action, no containment. It then spread 12%. What you see here in terms of this projected impact is the resulting economic damage. So you can see that some of the most heavily potentially affected county would be Cytisus, and I think that would be impact from Scotch Broom to agriculture specifically. And so really wanted to point this out, is that when you think about there being 16,000 acres of Scotch Broom, let's say, in the state, if you were to do a really rough bar napkin calculation, let's just say $500 an acre to control this, that puts total cost of controlling Scotch Broom at $8 million. And if you then look at the potential economic damage, you then have information to frame what that cost would be. And that was part of the reason why we prompted the Scotch Broom census, is because we really need better information. And as we have better information, we can then analyze it and start coming up with different options for the future, as well as do some cost comparisons. And if people want to see more, we really do need your help in contributing that data. And we really do need these types of numbers to help decision makers allocate resources. So what is happening? There's a lot happening, and it's really difficult to summarize all the awesome work that's happening, especially coming out of the Scotch Broom census, where we're asking everyone in Washington State to look for Scotch Broom. The challenge is when we're being effective in managing it, you don't see it. And so it's tough to really capture the amount of great work that's going on around the state. But you have local, county noxious weed control boards enforcing the law and making landowners control it where it is mandated for control. You also have counties that have a lot of Scotch Broom that don't do the law enforcement, that do education and provide technical assistance to landowners. Most, if not all, county noxious weed control boards provide recommendations to landowners so that they can manage their issue safely and effectively. And something that we also were able to help communicate during the Scotch Broom census is that many county noxious weed control boards have equipment such as weed wrenches or similar lever type products that they make available to landowners at no cost. Some counties have cost share programs for herbicides or other things. And so we really do recommend that if you are concerned about your Scotch Broom, that you connect with your local resources to investigate the different opportunities that exist. It's really difficult to summarize them, and you really need to ask. And something else to point out is that conservation districts play a really big role in stopping Scotch Broom and managing it as well. And while there isn't necessarily a Scotch Broom removal fund through conservation districts, there's many programs and cost share opportunities that are available for fire mitigation and other things. So I'm speeding this up here. I realize I'm almost out of time. But what's happening? So there's the regulatory aspect, there's assistance that can be provided, but volunteers and nonprofits and land trusts are doing a ton of work across the state. There are just an incredible amount of effort going into managing this at a local level. And we would really like to connect you, if you're passionate, with your local park, your local land trust, to continue the fight. What we should all think about with Scotch Broom is that, yes, there is a lot of Scotch Broom in certain areas, but there's more areas that don't have it, even in the heavily infested counties. And so this should be a call to action for everyone to take simple steps to prevent the introduction of Scotch Broom to areas that it's not currently located. And we would love to give you some contacts to install boot brushes in your local park or trail if you don't have them. So quickly summarizing the Scotch Broom census, would like to recognize all the different people that contributed to this effort. And with this better understanding of where Scotch Broom is and what the patch is, we then are now challenged to dig into that information to try to figure out what the future looks like. And would like to shout out the two top reporters as well. And I would just like to share these photos because for me, this really showed the damages that Scotch Broom poses to our recreation, to our fire, to our health, and really landscape health, and really every aspect of Washington that we know and love. And seeing these photos really prompted me to feel really fired up about this, and I'm hopeful that I'm conveying that. But we can stop at Scotch Broom, we can manage it, but it's really going to take a little bit more action from everyone to be effective. And here you can see all the different points that are now our better understanding as a state, including the census results and all the different reports that have been made prior to this. And when you look at that, I'm going to pivot to Troy in a moment, but I think that the number one thing to take away from this is that if you look at a statewide perspective or a national perspective, even a county, you forget, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. The battle to stop Scotch Broom really is yard to yard, trail mile to trail mile, river mile to river bend, and it's really a call to action for all of us. There are a lot of areas that don't have Scotch Broom, and we should all do what we can. Just a little bit more cumulatively will have a big impact on this species. So what does the future hold? We're going to explore that over the rest of this week, and we intend to keep this conversation going into the future. So what does it hold? It really depends on you, everyone participating in this, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you, and I'm sorry, Troy, for eating into your time. Now I'm passing it over to Troy Abercrombie with the Western Invasives Network to provide an overview of Scotch Broom in Oregon. Go ahead, Troy.
Can you see my screen fine? Are we good?
Looking good.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Justin, Jill, and Ingrid for getting us started here. So happy to see so many attendees here today. Amazing. I see 236 attendees, so thank you all for joining us. I want to give a little overview on the state of Scotch Broom here in Oregon. I haven't been able to keep this under 12 minutes yet, but I will do my best. We'll start with the regulatory status here too. As most of you know, it is a B-list weed in the state of Oregon, regionally abundant, eradication at the statewide level is certainly unlikely. And because of its status, state intervention and financial support for projects is certainly case by case and it's sometimes limited. I think the caveat to that would be the Oregon Department of Transportation and Oregon State Parks certainly put a lot of time into Scotch Broom. And ODA does fund numerous projects. So I want to make sure to give credit where it's due. ODA released biocontrol for the first time around 1983, and there are currently 3 biocontrol agents that have been released for Scotch Broom, and we'll hear some more about that later on in the symposium, I believe today. But there's a seed weevil, a beetle, and a twig miner. Similar to Washington, the sale, transport, and propagation of Scotch Broom is prohibited through the noxious weed quarantine statute that covers all A and B weeds, with some exceptions. Scotch Broom does not get one, though. This is what Oregon distribution looks like, and I would be willing to bet that that 15,000 acre estimate in Washington is way on the low side. And I'm glad that the census has happened and things are moving up there. Here in Oregon, we have at least 1.5 million acres infested, which is over 2% of our land mass, according to a report by the Oregon Department of Ag from 2014. We have over 7.6 million susceptible acres in the state. So just as in Washington, while there is a lot of Scotch Broom, there is a lot of places where there is not Scotch Broom. There was ornamentals, there was all kinds of different ways that it's has been brought in, probably in a similar time frame, late 1800s. Finding a reliable date is pretty difficult. But in addition to escaped ornamentals and things like that, there were some intentional plantings in the good old days in the name of erosion control and dune stability. As far as the dunes go, I think we decided that it wasn't quite working good enough, so we planted some European beach grass, but that's another symposium. Huge impacts with that kind of distribution. You can expect big impacts. And so this is from that same ODA report, this graphic. And as much as I want to highlight the damage caused by Scotch Broom, which is only rivaled by blackberry, I think it's important to note the great job we've been doing on all the rest of those species on this chart in our effort to keep them from getting to the point of Scotch Broom and blackberry. So great job to all the managers out there with their EDRR efforts. I know some of those species like rush skeleton weed are a real pain. So kudos to all of you who are working so hard. That $40-ish million economic loss per year accounts for 47% of all the losses in the state due to noxious weeds. But I think more alarming is that if all of those susceptible acres were infested, and if the impact per acre remained constant across all of those acres, which of course it probably wouldn't, but if it did, we'd be talking about $205 million in annual losses. And that's a pretty scary number. But I think the silver lining to that is that means we've got a lot of room for success. And there's $150 million on the table. So EDRR on the fringe, and on this line between the red and the yellow is going to be extremely important. Certainly if you are in the gray or the green and you see some Scotch Broom kicking up, you're going to want to get on that. Although I think it has been somewhat debunked, you do hear a lot of talk about health concerns for folks with allergies and respiratory issues, and whether it is an actual allergen or not, it is perceived to be one. So potato, potato. Also referring back to the economic impact report from ODA, it's got a lot of good info. A 40% increase in Scotch Broom cover can double the level of forest degradation in that habitat. Of course, there's a lot of parameters to that, and I'm sure some variability from site to site. But to think about that kind of exponential effect is pretty scary. And then I really love old plant art, so just had to throw that in there. With all of the distribution, there is a lot of action. I mentioned the State Department of Transportation. They treat lots of miles and lots of cumulative acres of infested right-of-way. And then we have a ton of great work going on from different partners protecting high-value sites across the state. Some of the ones I've listed here are just ones that I have been able to see up close or be involved in, but there is a lot more out there. And most of those efforts all require the use of volunteer action groups. And so it's great that folks are willing to donate their time. We'll hear from a couple of those groups throughout the symposium. And then we have opportunistic inclusion in higher priority projects. You'll see it a lot on the South Coast when you have broom and gorse intermixed with each other, or if you have a knotweed project and you've got some riparian Scotch broom, a lot of times we'll take that opportunity to do what we can to get rid of it. It takes a whole lot of people, and this is just an example. The National Park Service Invasive Species Program on the North Coast has a really active and successful Scotch broom program, and it's built on education, it's built on inclusion, and it depends on partnership. And I want to call these out by name. I hope I have time, but I think it's important to recognize them. The Northwest Youth Corps, the American Sign Language Crew, the Rainbow Crew, NYC Interns, Student Conservation Corps, NCLC Field Crews, the Latino Heritage Internship Program, Youth Conservation Corps, Park Volunteers, both state and national, and Mosaics in Science Intern. Could not be done without the engagement and the willingness of those folks to donate their time, their expertise, and their money. So thank you to all of those folks. And so moving forward, what are we going to do? Now is the time for action, as if it wasn't already. Now is always the time. And with Scotch broom and many other species, we are past the point of who's to blame for this. It doesn't matter anymore. We have a discipline that has a large percentage of its funding is soft money. And so when you have that, you have already shaky budgets that have been now devastated by the global pandemic. And all of us have a story now of how we've been affected. So because of that, we need help from the public more than ever, facilitating those volunteer projects, finding your fringe. I sent out an email talking about Courtsville Creek, and that's my fringe. And that's a place where I hope to engage my community and get in there and do some good work. But I also think the one thing that the Scotch Broom Census showed me was we have a public who's willing to engage. They're active and they're excited about Scotch Broom and among other weeds. But with Scotch Broom, it became clear from some of the feedback that we've done a bad job of getting our message across. We've gotten messages out, but we're not getting them across. And I have contributed to that as a manager myself. And so going forward, I think it's going to be crucial to make sure with everything we manage that we bring the people with us, that we explain to them the science that we're using to make that decision to move on to something else where we can be more effective. But that doesn't mean we're going to stop assisting folks, that we're going to stop helping folks manage it. We need to bring folks with us. And I just think it's very important, from the mechanisms for control, limitations of agencies, whether it be ownership or resources, and just why we make the decisions we make as managers. And as we make those decisions, educating the public on how they fit into that next phase. And money. If there was ever a time, although it is very awkward at this time, now is the time to advocate to fund your department, to fund your program. As we comb through budgets and we look at what is essential, what is required, and what is important when it comes to our economy, to keeping our natural landscapes healthy, to protect ecosystem services. And when we put all of that in the context of climate change, now is certainly the time. And if you don't get a slice of the pie on this round, I can guarantee you the slice you'll get on the second round will be smaller. And so I really just want to encourage you all to make your case, however awkward it may be.